So good morning and welcome back. So we've had a great start to the morning, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the rest of the morning, which will be a fascinating discussion on the opportunities and challenges of developing diagnostics to support personalized medicine. We're going to explore some of the challenges associated with moving diagnostics from their concept into clinical use. Now, at the conference here, we're allocating significant time to diagnostics. And so I thought in my opening remarks, I'd just give you some of the context of why we as an organizing committee, when we discussed the agenda, thought this was an important topic to spend time on. And the reason is personalized medicine can often be associated with actually the therapy selection. But actually, before we get into that therapy selection, we must diagnose the disease to actually have the perfect personalized medicine and the right option. And because of that, actually, diagnostics is often a less well understood field than the field of drug development. But in personalized medicine, the two actually have to be very closely linked together, particularly, and as we heard reference to, and you'll hear more of the data, that the significance of the high percentage of new therapies coming through are actually biomarker driven and therefore need a biomarker diagnostic. Now, diagnostic test developers are working hard to make personalized medicine possible, and we're working to give tools to physicians that help them select the optimal treatment for each patient. But doing so, we have to navigate what is a complex business and policy landscape. And we have to be mindful every day, and we heard some of the comments already about payers and healthcare providers in this landscape. Now, while many of the challenges are actually the same globally, what we also observe is implementation happens on a very local stage, not only just here in Boston, the variance we've heard between here and a rural area, but also globally, the regulatory and the payer environment we're navigating is complex and different. And so I think what you'll find today is our panelists are uniquely qualified to explore those challenges, developing diagnostics through multiple lenses that they represent. Now, the lens will include those of physicians who obviously, for now, they want more precise testing and they want it now. You'll also hear, and we touched on a little bit this morning, where the regulators in this and what is the role and how we can participate. And the payers who are calling for more evidence of clinical utility, but how do we do that? You know, as I think about it, and from where I was sat actually in the audience there, I was thinking perhaps the best way is framing it, and we're, one of the pleasures I have of being part of the Personalized Medicine Coalition is also having the patients present here and reminding of those journey. Everyone in this room is also focused on that patient outcome, so it's at least something we can all align on. A recent PNC blog, a patient, Brad Parry, sat over there, described actually his difficult journey in trying to gain access to genomic sequencing at a leading institution. He lamented the fact that the patient access to personalized medicine diagnostics is still excruciatingly slow, and I think we can all agree that's unacceptable. And so, that's a leading medical institution, and we also agree that the progress outside of that, where in the case of oncology, 80% of the patients just isn't the same. I think as we look forward, and we've talked about sort of where it's been, but if you look sort of 5 years out, we're imagining and believe, I'm certainly a believer that the physicians will diagnose patients differently today, and the patients will get and expect greater precision in their diagnostic odyssey. And we touched on this, what will that require? That's going to require greater facilities within the diagnostic testing, more data analytics, and we'll touch on in some of the later panels the data and the introduction of machine learning and artificial intelligence to that. And so we're going to bring significantly more data to an individual's diagnostic, not only what this conference is focused on in genomics, but also we started to touch on the proteome, metabolome, the role of the microbiome in some of the other areas. The data will need to come together. And so before physicians can draw on this data to treat a patient like Brad in the future, our industry has got to make significant progress. And that industry change has got to look like this is not us trying one test after another in search of the answer. In fact, it's got to be the opposite, that we can actually bring the right precise test. So we're going to need the science to come together. We're going to need to inform better clinical diagnostics, that in the end get better treatment plans from their families for otherwise what is a long patient journey. And the rigors of regulatory approval are necessary and reimbursement. And they're as much about preventing misguided testing and treatment plans on poor outcomes as they are on cost. So we've got two panels, and they'll give you different perspectives. We have no shortage of challenges, and one of the things Ed pointed out in a note to the panelists is actually what we're looking for is not just those challenges again, that I think many of the group are there, but also a lot of solutions. So the challenge I throw out to you is in that area. I will set up the panel in some way by saying there are three areas that I'm looking for, that the questions I have, and the beauty of going first, I don't have to wait for the mic later. I can say my questions fall into three areas. One is in clinical utility. I think we touched on it already a little bit, but how do we assess it? Should there be a standard? Can there be a standard? How do we measure the impact of the test on the treatment of the health outcome? Molecular testing in oncology has been mentioned already has changed in recent years and is hopefully a model, and I'm sure we'll hear other therapeutic areas maybe also can be a model in beyond oncology. But it's still, if you go to the community settings, and to quote one of the readings panelists I have, and the community settings and payers, that's still very different. Policies that recognize multiplex tests we need multiple lines of therapy. The prevalence of immune therapies are essential and long overdue, as we heard. So how do we align this personalized medicine with payers, with the deployment of these benefit managers to manage both the test utilization and the coverage? And do we as a diagnostics consider where the pharmaceutical has gone into the value-based care? So that's my first set of questions. The second is the scaling. So can we scale the test to provide greater access? We often give these sort of examples of areas we say are the future, but actually they really are just an N of one, an experiment. And how do we get adoption? One of the things I thought fascinating in the study, and you'll hear more from the study that LEK did for us, was that even within the same academic medical center, there's variance of implementation. So how do we get standardization of care for all the patients? You heard an example of what the Dana-Farber is doing, but I can tell you it's not common. We know education is key, the physicians and medical schools. What are the pros and cons of local testing done locally versus centralized testing that may have more expertise? How do we encourage the open networks and the sharing of data? Ultimately, how do we give groups like the tumor boards that advice? And then finally, the technology, which was really what the first panel is, and I somewhat agree with Mike's opening statement, and certainly Thermo Fisher as a technology provider, we often think that's the least of our challenges. But how do we approach this new era of multi-marker? How do we treat the treatment, stratification and selection? And particularly, how can we work together when we're investing, when others are investing? What is the right model of joint investment between diagnostics and pharma and vice versa? It's panels I've been on in previous PMC, and we still, I don't think, have figured all that out. So the industry we recognize isn't in a vacuum. We're faced with many uncertainties, but the patients and the physicians are not waiting around for us to figure out and don't actually want to hear it's about policy or reimbursement. They just want to get on with their therapy. So with that, I'd like to introduce Howard to introduce the first panel and turn it over to bring us some of the solutions.
Thank you, Mark. It's a delight to be able to be back here yet again, and also to have such an exciting group of folks that are going to be on this particular panel. If the panelists could go ahead and come up, fight for who gets to get the best seat. Looks like Kenna already has her eye on one of them there. So we have a really great panel, and obviously in terms of talent, but also in terms of different areas of the continuum from discovery through to implementation. We have some geographic diversity. We have folks from Israel, we have folks from the United States, and we have folks from La Jolla. So a lot of international reputation there. So that's what I talked about. I couldn't resist. Down at the very end is Asaf Halavi from Israel. He is the CEO of To Be Precise, which is really beautiful systems integrating in to clinical decision support, as well as a lot of the other interpretive services. Next to him is Kenna Milshah, who's obviously famous for her work on the Cancer Genome Atlas, but has been at MD Anderson for quite a while now. Please do not mention the Washington Nationals to her. She's a passionate baseball fan. It would be cruel for you to mention the Washington Nationals to her. So please do not mention the Washington Nationals. Thank you for doing that. And she's the executive director of MD Anderson's Institute for Personalized Medicine. It's been really in the thick of it for the last decade plus. Next is Hakan Sakuf, who's vice president and head of diagnostics at Pfizer. Pfizer's a little pharmaceutical company, I guess you'd call them, based out of the world. And has been very active. And Hakan's been a real leader in thinking about how do we use biomarkers for discovery, how to use biomarkers for development, and then how to think about how they're going to be used in practice. And those are all three very different things, as he will, I'm sure, bring out. Next up is Chris Joshi. And Chris is executive vice president at Change Healthcare, really looking at the heavy lifting that can now be done, and I'm sure he'll bring that out in terms of the IT solutions. It's not just a case of a little bit of data that leaks out to guide healthcare, but really some significant amounts of data can be used, as we'll bring in. And then last but not least is Peter Mag, who's here. He's based out of the Bay Area, CareDx. He's not only a PMC board member, as is Hakan and Chris, but is also, it heads up CareDx, which is in the solid organ transplant setting. I guess you do liquid organ as well, but in that area. So again, very much science all the way through to practice. So rather than going through each individual, their height and weight at birth and all the way through, that is provided in the documents. So you can read all about their exciting lives. And there's a new PBS documentary on each of them that will be appearing shortly, I'm sure. But maybe we could start with you, Hakan. In the context of trying to bring things to market, you're in an interesting situation where you're thinking about how things are going to be in practice, but then have to think all the way back to something being a molecule. So maybe if you could comment a little bit about some of your thoughts of how do you make it from those early, very ethereal type of positions towards something much more focused that can go through a regulatory and clinical process.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel and pointing out that I come from La Jolla. I used to live here, and now I know why I don't live here anymore. So it's, when we look at biomarkers and in the context of clinical trials, we're starting with early biomarkers, and we have groups also internally inside the company that work in reviewing the science and looking for those biomarkers. Certainly through our own collection of samples, but also external data. For us, we need to have these robust biomarkers, so science really has to deliver for us before we're able to actually use them in the clinical setting. But it all, if you look at the company size Pfizer, certainly in some therapeutic areas, precision medicine has really taken off. So in the case of oncology, for example, precision medicine is applied. The principles of precision medicine are applied to pretty much every development program, every program coming into research. And in other areas, actually, it's similar, but not in all cases we can have these robust biomarkers that we can take forward. But maybe to give you a sense of how that works, so again, in early stages, when clinical teams, research teams start focusing on different areas, they do look at the prevailing science, and we do stay connected to them and help them understand if they have a biomarker that they actually want to use to stratify a patient population, what that really means for the end product, because in the end, it has to go to markets. And in the end, if it requires given this a diagnostic panel, if it requires a companion diagnostic test, how do we go about enabling that and making sure that it not only it can be developed, but it can be commercialized and effectively so globally, because we're not just U.S.-centric. And that's a multi-part consideration. If you look at, we so far have 3 drugs in the U.S. with companion diagnostics on the market, one with 2 indications. So we have a total of 5 PMA approvals, PMA and SPMA approvals, and we have 16 other approvals globally for the same drugs in markets where it required a different application to get them on the market. So if you look at in the context of how we work, and the first one was in 2011 with Salcori, so it's been really in a relatively short time. But it also shows where the science has gone and is going, and how that's actually helping us in segmenting patient populations and arriving at hopefully products that are more efficacious in the patient population for which they're indicated. So it's a learning exercise for us, has been, because we don't have a diagnostics division. We don't manufacture diagnostics. So we work with external companies to bring these diagnostics to market, and those that I mentioned, a total of 21 approvals. We've gone through multiple diagnostic companies to get there, and it's a lot easier said than done, and we can go into more detail, so I don't want to dominate the whole conversation, but it is, for us, it really starts with science. We can't necessarily increase the speed of science at our will, but we can definitely contribute to it through our data collections, through working with outside companies, but also making use of our biobank collection, which we do with multiple outside investigators.
So Peter, you have a similar but different situation in that you're not developing a drug, but you're trying to understand how you can use the biology to make better selections of therapy, of management, et cetera. So maybe you could comment a little bit about that idea to practice design in your particular space.
No, absolutely. What we do at CareDx, we focus on the long-term outcome of transplant patients. And transplant patients are really at the pinnacle of medical science, because you think, when do you transplant an organ into a human being? It's incredibly complex. It's really at the end of a long, long journey. And while many organizations are talking about patients, I started today talking about Richard Knight, which sits here in the audience, which is a kidney transplant recipient. And it's so important that we actually have patients among us, because I think I could talk endless about liquid biopsies. I could talk about proteomics and all the great information that we gather. And probably if I had sat here 5 or 10 years ago, I would have talked about blood-based information as being such a wonderful ability to learn more. But today I would talk about patient information. We at CareDx now manage patients on the wait list. We then match organs to recipients with our diagnostics. We then have a surveillance tool that allows us, based on sequencing technology, to actually different cell-free DNA from a recipient and the organ, so to monitor their risk of rejection. And then we have an electronic medical records company that manages this in 60 hospitals across the country. So what I'm describing to you over the last 10 years, it has taken a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and that's a joke. In our case, it's probably as much blood, as much sweat, and as much tears, in order to actually make sure that transplant patients live longer. And my personal goal is to impact longevity in transplantation by 3 years. And we have a very clear model. Wouldn't it be great to be part of that journey, that today transplant patients live for 10 to 15 years? They're highly, highly complex patients because of this organ and recipient. Wouldn't it be great to extend that by 3 years? And I think with our solutions, we can actually make that happen. And for me, this is all what precision medicine is ultimately about, is to how do you measure outcomes? And in our case, it's graft survival is really a good marker. And so for being focused on managing longevity of a patient population, I think is incredibly important. Moving away from an original focus on mode of action, on developing a single molecule, into much more, how can I manage a patient population and make a difference?
So Kenny, you have a similar scenario with the cancer program that you're leading, looking at patients trying to choose therapies, maybe not based on anatomy, but based on other features, having to pull the science together, the pharmacology together, et cetera. Maybe you can comment a little bit about some of the challenges and solutions as you have moved forward in that.
Sure. So our institute's really focused more at the interface between testing and implementation of those tests and the data from those tests, trying to understand when a clinician realizes that there's even a test result in the medical record that might be actionable, what options are actually available to the patient. I would say even though I'm at MD Anderson Cancer Center, home of the Houston Astros, go Astros. Even though we're at MD Anderson, which you would think, because of our large portfolio of clinical trials and personalized medicines that we have available, we're not, and I wish, is Raju still here? Because I'd love to talk to him about a statement earlier today about how almost every patient at Dana-Farber gets tested. That's different from the last time I talked to folks at Dana-Farber, and it's definitely not the case at MD Anderson. We're not testing every cancer patient that walks in our doors. And even when they're tested, we don't utilize the data efficiently. And I think that's more true than not for most patients. I think, Laura, I don't know where you are. I know, Laura, at least from what you said, you saw that experience. I know Brad has seen that experience, that getting access to testing, unless you're one of these level 1 tumor types that has an FDA approval, can actually be quite a challenge getting that test reimbursed. And then even if the test result actually tells us or gives us a hint that's reasonably well articulated by literature, supported by literature, getting those patients the appropriate therapies that would match is actually quite a challenge. We've recently just done a study which I think does support that regardless of what tumor type, if you do decision support, so you provide clinicians with education in real time, because that's been one of our major challenges, is educating our clinicians to the changing landscape of not only what a mutation means or what a biomarker is, because not all biomarkers are created equally, right? What the changing landscape of drugs and clinical trials are, that we can actually change physician behavior and then change and improve patient outcomes. So that's really the focus of what we're working on.
Now, Asif, you have, it really leads into a lot of the work that you and your team have been doing, trying to figure out how to pull in a number of features about the patient, including molecular and other tools, to try to help really move forward towards clinical decision support. So maybe you can comment a little bit about some of the ways that your team's been tackling this.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, some of the things that, Kenny, you talked about are very relevant to a lot of other specialties way beyond oncology. The challenge of which genetic test is relevant to which of my patients is a challenge by itself. And even if I do have this test coming back, then do I really understand genomics to the level that I can manually translate this into practical clinical actions at the point of care as a physician? And finally, to your point, can I really be able to have some technology that will help me go back to the available genomic signature or finding that is available maybe from a test that I've done, but I don't want to look at it once just because I got it now and I'm in the context of what I'm trying to solve right now. I want to be able to help the patient next time, let alone pedigree management and so on, around that. So all those challenges, I think, at the very last mile of a lot of things that you guys just talked about are not solved. And the physician end up with an ocean of data, and now a tsunami of, order of magnitude, way bigger ocean of data that they expected to be processed and used as well. And guess what? Patients are ahead of the physicians with that at the same time. And maybe last comment I will say, because I think this is relevant from the pharma perspective as well, the ability to close the loop back to the physician, where eventually you want to be able to measure efficiency of research, guidelines and outcomes all the way through a closed loop between the research and development all the way back is I think also a not yet digitally fully closed loop. That's kind of our angle to what we're trying to help with.
So Chris, in the previous session, we heard a fair amount about how to scale this so that it not only helps more people, but it helps more people in places that may not be used to rapid innovation. And so, some of the community settings where they're not ready for that. They're having trouble keeping up with yesterday's treatment, much less what's coming tomorrow. You've worked, your company and you yourself have worked a little bit in this space of scaling and really thinking about, maybe you'd comment a little bit about how you see this part of it going.
Great. Well, first of all, it's great to be back here at the conference. I must say it's my favorite conference of the year. Great to be back. And just about this time of the year, I'm always thinking about moving to La Jolla every year. But for the last, I know, looking forward to it someday.
Houston's also good this time of year. Home of the Astros.
My wife's getting into surfing, so.
Can't help you there.
So the technology company's perspective in this always revolves around the use of data, right? So I'm going to make some comments about the progress that the field has made in terms of making the data more useful. And I'll just say two things that are sort of very noticeable from where I sit. Change Healthcare as a company, for those of you who don't know us, we're one of the biggest healthcare IT companies that nobody has heard of. And that's partly because we are always sitting behind the scenes of all the different systems people talk about all the time, like the medical record system or the pharmacy system. We connect everybody. So we are the largest network in the United States. We connect hundreds of millions of people, have about $1 trillion worth of healthcare that gets transacted through our networks every year. So we see a ton of data about what's really going on in the healthcare system, from a reimbursement perspective, also from the choices that people make, that consumers make. I'm going to start by asking a simple question. Does anyone know the fastest growing payer in the United States today? It's the patient, right? It's the consumer. It's not United Healthcare, it's not Aetna or the Blue Cross plan, it's the out-of-pocket patient. And that has a very significant impact on the decision-making about who pays for something, including a diagnostic. So if you're a first-time cancer patient diagnosed for the first time, chances are that you're going to be paying out-of-pocket for that very first diagnostic until you hit your $5,000 or $8,000 deductible. Now think about the impact that has. Just like the pharmaceutical industry realized maybe 10, 15 years ago that it was important to advertise and educate consumers directly and not just wait for the physicians to deliver all the messaging. I think the same thing is going to be true for a lot of personalized diagnostics because people are being forced in some way to take more charge, a greater charge of their financial decisions, but also in a related sense, their clinical decisions. The decision about which physician a patient calls for a second opinion or which cancer center they go to, whether it's in the community or at an academic medical center, can make a very big difference in what kind of testing they get, whether it's the personalized diagnostic or something else that's standard of care or even maybe lower than standard of care. The second thing I would point out is the growing capabilities in being able to deliver decision support in the physician's workflow. I often hear about this, well, what's it going to take to change the guidelines, to get physicians better educated? And for a long time, there was a gap, which was basically the EHRs and the medical record systems that are really difficult to update and that could not take content from the cloud, that content that comes from outside the healthcare system, that may be highly personalized based on the patient's own data, and being able to deliver that in the workflow of the physician. It may not be surprising to people, but the way that problem got solved was on the backs of a reimbursement problem. But CMS said that they would not reimburse for medical imaging unless there was decision support in the workflow before the ordering happened. It drove behavioral change, right? So all the EHRs now allow cloud-based, real-time decision support to be delivered in front of the physician, right in the Epic system or right in the Cerner system, that drives decision-making around radiology imaging. The great news is that once those rails have been laid, you can now reuse those rails for any kind of decision support that you want to push down to the physician. So I feel it's a milestone that should be recognized. So we're doing that today with almost every EHR out there. And we think that that's going to provide a lot more opportunity for delivering personalized decision support in the clinician's workflow. And last but not least, I heard a lot of discussion this morning about patients getting access to their data. And that is an area that has massively exploded in the last 2 or 3 years, much pleasantly to my surprise, personally, having been involved in the data liquidity and interoperability space for almost 20 years now. I'm really happy to say that now there are tens of millions of records that get exchanged in real time over our networks all over the place. So more than 70 million unique individuals' records get moved around as needed through our networks today. On a daily basis, we are seeing roughly 2 million medical records being pulled in real time. And all of these records are now available for patient access. I think that is absolutely critical, because if you get the patients to be able to tap into these records and be able to manage their own consent, you could actually have the ability to empower the patient, build personalized diagnostics and insights based on that information, and then be able to send that information back into the physician's workflow. I never thought that would happen in my lifetime, but I'm glad to see the tip of the iceberg emerging there.
Thanks, Chris. So I think education has come up and it really blends into some of the 3 areas that Mark set up at the preamble for this session. And at least at our institution down in Tampa, there's different types of education. Initially we were trying to train everyone to become a molecular biologist and a molecular pharmacologist. And then we realized that, first of all, they didn't want to be that. Secondly, they didn't need to be that. And so maybe, Asif, you could talk a little bit about how do we train people to make better decisions about what to order, and then use the available utilities to be able to manage those orders. And that balance, it's very different from what it used to be. The people my age are used to having to carry the water themselves, and now there's a cart that can carry it. So how should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, I think maybe we can take an example, SSRIs, as something that physicians debate which one to pick, and it's like 40% hit or miss in many cases. We have some experience in actually rural Tennessee and actually up in Detroit as well, where we are talking with people that couldn't even spell pharmacogenomics, let alone, to your point, the molecular perspective of what's going on. All they need is a clinically translated, actionable information that is synthesized to what they need right now without the whole, do I need to become a geneticist just because now I need to deal with genomic information, yes or no, let alone that they don't teach it in medical school anyhow. So could we create a translation between the genomic potential of science to help them decide which SSRI is the right one? And we can tell the same story on blood thinners or behavioral health medications and a lot of other things. Maybe we can just create this bridge that translates the genomic potential into clinical certification of SSRIs to pick from with the justification. And if you're one of those physicians that do want to go and drill down into, here's the publication, here's the reference, here's why, we think that this thing should be considered, than the other, let alone here's why we see the active meds that your patient is on that maybe potentially could be influenced by something that we didn't consider. And just deliver that clinical flavor of the actions to consider versus here's a genetic result report, knock yourself up with, understanding the cross-clinical genomic, so to speak, information and insights out of it.
So Ken, one of the difficulties with this whole area is you have aspects that are relatively well regulated, the diagnostic lab, for example, and you have aspects that are regulated, but really the practice of medicine types of tools, and then that interaction back and forth. You have clinician autonomy that you want to preserve to some level, but not to the point where they can harm people, all the way through to knowing that we want to have the gutter guards down on the bowling alley so that at least the ball will hit pins and not go into the gutter. So you're in a complex institution. Thinking about these things going together as you try to move progress forward, maybe you can make some comments there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges that we've seen at our institution is this balance between running what is still a cancer center and an academic institution. We're still running it as a business. We still have to end up in the black or try to at the end of the year. And this idea that innovation can be the enemy of the clinical laboratory. And sometimes to the clinician, right, because who has to keep up with all of this information as they move forward. And somebody made a comment earlier about, if you talk to an insurer or payer, if you talk to one, you've talked to one. Well, if you've talked to one clinician yesterday, you've talked to him at that moment in time yesterday, but then you still have to tell him again today, and him tomorrow, and him the next day. And so this trying to make sure we provide the information that's necessary to keep them on the right rails, right? So we've got plenty of situations, dozens and dozens and dozens of examples where a clinician will get a patient report back, and it'll say, well, your patient has an FGFR fusion. And so they're ready to go put this patient on an FGFR inhibitor because that makes sense, but the fusion didn't have the kinase domain. And so how do we make sure that we're providing these clinicians with the right information at the right moment in time and doing it in this dynamic way, right? So that when the patient actually comes back, right now they got tested when they're actually NED or stable disease on their current form of treatment, but they really need it in 6 months or a year when their patient progresses, and to remind them that that report is actually present in the medical record and may or may not still be relevant. And doing that in real time has been a challenge, and then reminding them constantly that that information is still available to them and relevant for that patient. That's really been our focus, to try to change physician behavior in that way.
So it kind of leads in a little bit, and you commented a bit on this. You're working with external parties to develop the companion diagnostics and going forward. And I think it's one thing that the field's kind of recognizing, that the regulatory process from a phase 1 trial through to approval in terms of companion diagnostics is very clean and very clear. But then afterwards, there's practicalities like you only have so much tissue in that needle biopsy. And so you can't do all the FDA-approved CDXs. You need to just do another one. How do you interact with that interface as we try to move the field forward, but not in a Wild West type, excuse the way of pun, Wild West sort of way?
Well, I think it is a Wild West out there eventually, even if you put a companion diagnostic on the market, on the drug label. So this is it's a difficult issue because, just think about the end product on the market, and let's say we have a companion diagnostic attached to it, and we put that through trials to get that clinical utility, and that the drug did get the approval. And now we're on the market, could be US or elsewhere, doesn't matter, but we're on the market, and now there's immediate competition to that particular test. I guess I'd like to look at this more from the point of view of the patient. So if I'm the patient and I do get a test, and that test says I should be getting that drug, let's say it's a false positive. But what if it's a false negative? Probably even worse. False positive, maybe I won't benefit from that particular drug. And if it's in the case of cancer, you don't have probably a lot of life. So you have that vested interest in the accuracy of that test. Either direction, if it's a false positive, now you just missed the opportunity to take a drug you were supposed to. With that, I don't mean to say LDTs are not as good as the test that's on the label. But we, as the company developing the drug, have the knowledge of that particular test that we put on alongside the trial. We use that test to select patients. So then we go on the market. Again, it does actually become the Wild West because there is no particular oversight on which test, who's taking which test, and what results it gets, and how that really affects patient care. Certainly in the case of the drug, if the patient doesn't respond, is that because it wasn't the right test? Maybe it was a false positive or not? I think these are all open questions. They're difficult ones. And certainly we, on the pharma side, can't really be the arbiter of the test and try to try every one of them. This is a topic I know we talked a little bit about at the board meeting yesterday, but I've talked about this with multiple diagnostic providers as well. It's a difficult thing for them also. Certainly outside the US, there are multiple tests that people use. I'm not sure there's an easy solution, although I think you did say in our panel call to come up with some recommendations rather than just complain about it. So I suppose one of those could be something I've said to multiple other parties and in other talks as well, is to consider, for a particular indication where we're developing a companion, perhaps look into what LDTs exist and look into perhaps rating them. And that could be done in the context of an existing institution and a reference sample set. That's one idea. I'm not sure, that's doable across all different indications, and, you have to think about, if it's cancers, do you have enough tissue to be able to do this? But it's a difficult question. We face this all the time, and we actually had a very unfortunate case several years ago where we did see and tested a technology that really wasn't delivering what it said it was delivering. And we had to put a medical alert out. And that's not really pleasant either. So, I think it's a regulatory oversight issue that I think deserves a lot of attention for the patients.
Peter, you wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, Hakan, but don't you think that there's a fundamental shift over the last 10 years where you would say the evidence development that's now requested on bringing a diagnostic to the market and have it used in terms of clinical utility definition is so much greater than it has been 10 years ago? I mean, all of you would probably know Klebeck, right? None of you, I guess, would know any BCR-able diagnostic test. Many of you now know Foundation Medicine, right? I hope many of you will know AlloSure, which is managing transplant patients. But I think we are now in a phase where these diagnostic testing solutions need to go through a very rigorous clinical utility trial. And then actually we'll need to go be part of a registry trial to demonstrate ongoing utility and health economic impact. So I think the bar has significantly changed for these diagnostic tests, as has reimbursement for these tests as well, as we're demonstrating a lot of value. So I think we're really in a sea change shift for diagnostics in terms of developing evidence by the time that we bring these solutions to the market.
Yeah, I was referring more to the process by which a laboratory-developed test goes to the market, not necessarily, there are many LDTs that have been on the market. There's plenty of data on them, but there are also those that may be competing with others that may perhaps don't have as much data on them. But I do agree that the stringency certainly on the PMA grade assays is really great. And when you're selecting patients based on that test, if the clinical trial is successful, it is an evidence that you did select, at least to some extent, the right patient population. Right. But I was referring more to the dual regulatory path in the U.S., but now outside the U.S. is changing as well. In the EU system, in another couple of years, it'll go into full effect, and it's substantially changing, I think becoming certainly more similar to what we have in the U.S. But then look at other countries where these drugs we put these drugs globally in many regions, and you look at what's being used in different countries for that particular drug, there isn't a lot of consistency. And that's, to me, I was looking at this again from the perspective, what if I were the patient taking that test? Which one would I want?
Yep. So we're heading into the final 8-9 minutes of our appointed time, and Del Pritchard, the Senior Vice President for Science Policy at Personalized Medicine Coalition, is the next moderator, and he does not mess around. He will clear us all out of there, so we do want to pay attention to that. Chris, maybe you could comment a little bit as you look across the landscape of this area. What are some of the solutions that, we've heard a little bit of some of the solutions, but what are some of the solutions you're thinking are just not being realized, not being appreciated, and need to be really emphasized a little bit more? And don't make them all from your company.
I'll try hard. I do think that as we take a wider lens on personalized healthcare, that we have an opportunity to not get too fixated on molecular diagnostics and testing as sort of the definition of what we take to consumers as personalized healthcare or personalized medicine. That is where the exciting science is, and we always, especially in this kind of an audience, love to talk about the next biomarker and the next LDT or companion diagnostic. But if you think about the shallow end of the pool, where it's much easier to get in with consumers, it's about very basic things. If it's about access, it's about transparency, it's about being able to empower them with their data well before they need it for something really complicated like a cancer diagnostic. Making sure that they know their choices when it comes to getting second opinions or even the first opinion for that matter, where you go. I think there's an enormous opportunity to empower consumers, to not think of the consumer as another cog in the wheel. I mean, the obsession with health plans and the reimbursement from health plans, I can tell you the best way to break down some of the barriers to getting health plan reimbursement is to actually first go to the consumers, get them be their own advocates, and as that momentum shifts, health plans pay attention. They just don't want to necessarily be the first ones out there experimenting and funding the experimentation and being financially responsible for that. But I see that as I'm a glass half or three-quarters full person about that. I think things are improving. And the final point I'll make is the data collection, the aggregation of information, evidence base is getting easier. And we should be taking full advantage of that because experimentation is never going to go away. The risks involved in introducing something new are not going to go away. The best we can do is to get the evidence base quicker at a lower price so that you can do more of these experiments, get more tests out there, get the bad ones off the market, and drive adoption of the ones that are really making a difference.
Thank you. Asif, your comments on the landscape opportunities where we need to realize more, the solutions we need to realize sooner?
Yeah, I think when I talk with people, many people talk about precision medicine as an umbrella, like a broad. Funny enough, they talk about precision medicine in the terms of the old world, where the average perspective is the right one, versus it's time to be precise. It's time to think practically what works, what doesn't work, and actually have a precision medicine strategy for genomic data management for organizations. And I think that's the beginning of the solution to start flipping, drive it top down as a strategy in the organizations versus bottom up, pockets of innovative people doing some stuff in their lab without any broader management. And I think this is to my opinion, is the key to start having this industry lead in a different way than before. The previous session was talking about interoperability and shared data and so on, and I look back at healthcare IT and say there's a lot of lessons learned that we can avoid doing those same mistakes in this new precision medicine world. We need to look back and plan ahead with some lessons learned versus let's continue to create this ocean of data that we're not organizing, and then we'll have meaningful use 6, 7, 200, whatever, to help us clean this mess again.
Thank you. Kenna?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I was thinking about this question, it really did come back to data in many ways. For me, I would like to get our clinicians, and it would have to start locally. As much as I'm pro data sharing, I mean, I led TCGA, which is one of the large data sharing programs in the country, in the world. We actually, our institution pulled out of one of the newest data sharing initiatives, Genie, the AACR Genie project, because we realized we couldn't even share data locally at our own institution, that we probably weren't being responsible by sharing it everywhere else if we couldn't even get it into our own researchers' hands and our own clinicians' hands first. And part of that is that we made this transition to the electronic health record where we really have an opportunity to utilize this in a really new way, but we have a lot of folks who are reticent to do so and to make changes in their own day-to-day practice to capture data in ways that we can utilize it. I joke, but it's not funny. One data element that I cannot capture at my institution systematically is diagnosis. Right? I can't capture, and I don't know how many of you work at a cancer hospital or another broader hospital. How many of you can capture your patient's diagnosis from a pathological perspective because they don't use a standard lexicon, right? These are big problems, and they're basic, and they're inherent to us being able to actually personalize anything downstream. Precision medicine is very much biomarker driven. It's not personalized, and I think we're going to need to be able to capture data in systematic ways and then demonstrate that we can leverage those data and the world doesn't implode when we share it in order to move the field forward.
Peter?
Well, the magic one question for me is, it's all about incentives. At the end of the day, it comes down, what do I incentivize? And for me, the biggest question would be, how do we incentivize long-term outcomes? In the United States, we're discovering 3,000 kidneys every year. because the 1-year graft survival metric was put in place. So what me as a transplant surgeon, what do? I only transplant really good kidneys into really low-risk patients, because that's going to be my best outcome after 1 year. So we have an outcome here in the United States of 94% graft survival after 1 year. But nobody cares about the 5-year. So I think all these questions and the data sharing and all would go away in a way if we find a 5-year or a 10-year outcome metrics and then have payers care about 5 and 10 years versus caring about the next year and making that bottom line, which I completely understand. But I think it has to do with the 5 to 10 year outcomes because, dementia is a big issue in my mind. If you can help me to manage my onset of dementia and push that out by 5 years, that'd be huge value to me. And every year I'm growing older, I'm getting more concerned around it because I would like to see the nationals one day and recognize it that way. Or be surfing in La Jolla or you get whatever.
That wasn't fair.
All right. Hakan, you want to bring us home?
So,
Will you do it anyway?
yeah. So I know a lot of people have talked about data, and obviously it's important to share. I wanted to give you just one example because she's not here, wasn't able to fly in because of the weather. Lauren Lehman heads up the blood pack, and there are others in the room who are members of the blood pack. And if you're a diagnostic company in the liquid biopsy space and you're not a member, you should come talk to me and Annie and others in the room. So that's one place where we do share a lot of data. And these are, I believe we have about 37 members now, companies, and actually most of these companies are competing with each other. But right now, we're all kind of building the airplane so we can then each take flights to our own destinations. But you do have to build that airplane first. So there's a lot of data sharing. We as a company are providing data from two different drugs and multiple clinical trials. And others who are members are also providing as such. I think it's really important to have groups like this put together where we share. So data sharing is one, but the other one that I'm also passionate about, and this is really big on the PMC agenda, is education. To me, the best patient is the most educated patient. And also we have a lot to learn from patients. I think if we listen, because someone else said this before, but patients are really experts in their diseases. And I think if we listen enough, we'll also learn from them. But educating healthcare providers, I recently heard from a speaker in a very reputable San Diego Cancer Center that some of their physicians had a 100% rate of actually ordering testing for their cancer patients, and some had 0%. So I asked, why 0 in such an institution? She said, because we need to educate them. So I think that education is not only for the healthcare providers, but also it is for patients. I think the more we learn, and I think it's difficult to do also because, for every paper you show me one way, I can probably pull out another 5 from the literature that will show the opposite. But I think it's a very significant component. PMC did some research into this a few years ago to find out, what people knew about personalized or precision medicine, and it was pretty embarrassing numbers in the healthcare provider space. So I think we share data, but we also need to share our knowledge, and we need to make sure that people understand what their choices are, and that's a lot easier said than done, but it does need to be done.
Thank you. So that finishes up the first part of the discussion, and just leaves it to please join me in thanking the panel for their time and their insight. Over to you, Daryl.
Thanks, Howard, and he's right. I'm not going to mess around, but not because I wanted to rush that terrific panel, but because the next panel has the privilege of being the last session before lunch. And I'm sure everybody wants to get to that as soon as possible, so we want to stay on time. So I'm going to call all of my panelists up where we're going to have a discussion to continue the discussion on clinical adoption of diagnostics. Here's So that was a great session, and thanks to Howard and all of the panelists for really kicking off our discussion about developing diagnostics. This next session, our panelists will examine the impact of emerging research on the clinical and economic utility of genomic sequencing for patients, not just with cancer. We're going to focus a lot on cancer, but also for rare and undiagnosed disease, non-invasive prenatal testing, and pharmacogenomics, and other areas where genomic testing is playing a role in today's healthcare. Joining myself, I'm Darrell Pritchard, the Senior Vice President for Science Policy at the Personalized Medicine Coalition, and joining me on this panel are my distinguished colleagues. First, Dr. Peter Newman, who's the Director of the Center for Evaluation of Value and Risk at the Institute for Clinical Research and Health Policy Studies at the Tufts Medical Center. Peter had the easiest commute to this conference. The others came from Utah and California, so a 10-minute drive, can't complain, even though it's 20 degrees outside this morning. Also joining me is Dr. Lincoln Nadoff, who's the Chief of Precision Health at the Intermountain Healthcare System, which is based in Utah, really a cutting-edge precision oncology and personalized medicine healthcare delivery institution that really leads sort of as an example of one of the leaders in the community for delivery and implementation of personalized medicine. Intermountain Healthcare is an integrated payer provider, so also joining us is Roy Gandolfi, who's the medical director for Select Health, which is the payer arm of the Intermountain Healthcare system. You can tell us a little more about Select Health's role, but really getting involved in some of the clinical adoption issues around genomic sequencing, but also personalized medicine in general. And last but not least is Amar Kedan, who's the Vice President and Global Head of Market Access at Illumina. We all know Illumina is a key developer and manufacturer of these genomic sequencing technologies, and also a leader in the market in this area. So thank you all for joining me today for this panel. Now, our discussion should focus on understanding the value of genomic sequencing to clinical care and for the healthcare system, with the theme of building evidence for providers and payers that may encourage clinical adoption. And I'm going to remind my team here that we want this to be an interactive discussion, so react to one another. Don't just wait for questions from me or me to say, okay, Lincoln, you answer this, Amar, you answer this. Really, if want to have this to be an engaged conversation. And I want to turn it over to the audience quickly to get you guys up to be able to ask questions and interact with some of these leaders in the field. So we'll do that quick. But first, before I ask you all to kind of give an opening statement about your perspectives on this issue of evidence development that's going to help encourage clinical adoption of diagnostics and genomic sequencing, I'll give you a little bit of background on the topic, just to kind of set the stage. Now, we all know genomic sequencing is a key technology in personalized medicine, with the promise of gathering of information on all genetic markers that may have a role in clinical decision-making on treatment decisions in a single test. So it sounds like it has a terrific potential for benefit to the healthcare system. On top of that, it has a unique place today in that as more and more biomarkers and genetic markers are being discovered and added to a panel that can be tested in a single test for genomic sequencing, that value proposition should only improve. But this comes with a cost, so it sounds great, and it should improve, having all of that information available should improve clinical outcomes, and it should also improve treatment efficiency. So the hope is that it will drive costs down for the healthcare system by avoiding those treatments that wouldn't be effective for many patients and getting them onto the most effective and most appropriate care right away. But genomic sequencing does not come without a cost. I mean, there's a lot being discussed about the $99 genome, but that's not really reflective of how much it costs to do this when you consider analysis as well. It's more in the lines of about $3,500 to do genomic sequencing. And there's a growing recognition that there's a need to prove the clinical utility, the clinical and economic value, to gather evidence of the clinical and economic value in order for this technology to be adopted broadly in the healthcare system. And we all know that without strong and convincing clinical evidence, payer and provider adoption may lag. So where are we now? There's been a lot of folks a lot of groups, a lot of organizations that have been trying to develop this evidence. It's not clear where this evidence is going to come from. The manufacturers of the technologies are limited before they're adopted into practice by clinical trials. So, and there's a need for practice-based evidence. So who develops this evidence is a big question which we'll begin to discuss. But there's a number of projects that have been done, and these projects are helping to build the evidence base for which providers and payers can look to start to influence their decision-making. And it's also, this evidence as it's starting to accumulate, has revealed some key challenges and barriers to the adoption of genomic sequencing in healthcare, practice barriers and elsewhere. So with that stage being set, I'm going to turn it over to my panelists to give you their perspectives. I'm going to start with Peter for a health economics perspective.
Well, thank you very much, Darrell, and really thank you for inviting me, and congratulations to you and Ed and the Personalized Medicine Coalition. I love this conference as well. It's very exciting to hear about all the technology and the promise for patients and families and the healthcare system. But as the economists on the panel, we have to ask the questions about evidence and value. We've been hearing about this throughout the day. Clinical utility, in terms of clinical evidence, clinical utility, percent diagnosed, percent actionable, percent change in management, outcomes. The sources will be trials and real-world data we've heard a little bit about. I'm going to make a big plug for models as part of the evidence-based toolkit, and they have limitations and challenges, but they can help us think about long-term consequences and uncertainty and things like that. In terms of evidence of value, the insurers, the payers are naturally asking the questions about whether the benefits are worth the costs, what are the budget implications, what are the potential savings from avoiding the diagnostic odyssey, in which patients, which strategies, which subgroups. Formal cost-effectiveness analysis can be part of the way forward. We haven't heard a lot about this today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. Cost per diagnosis, cost per quality is a word that hasn't come up today. A lot of challenges in measuring qualities, quality-adjusted life years. But we can do those things and use that information to compare across diverse treatments and diseases. The other benefit of cost-effectiveness analyses, in addition to letting us sort of understand value of different strategies, testing, treatment strategies, it helps shed light on uncertainty. It helps us characterize uncertainty. It helps us to ask what-if questions. What if the technology costs come down as we expect? What if the knowledge base and the technologies improve as we expect? When can we expect to get to situations, and in which subgroups and patients do we expect cost effectiveness? So thanks to the coalition, my colleagues, I have some with me, Tara Lavelle and Marlena Kiesler here. We are doing some work on cost effectiveness, and we will be coming out, perhaps next year you'll have us back, and we'll talk about some of our results. And we will be measuring cost effectiveness in some of these terms I've mentioned, cost per diagnosis, cost per qualities. Final point, in addition to those traditional cost effectiveness analyses, where the road and the math is frankly hard for a lot of the tests, we've heard this, percent diagnosed, percent actionable, might be rather low. It might improve over time. It will be different in different contexts, to be sure. We need to think about other measures of value. It hasn't come up a lot today, but beyond traditional endpoints, value to families of ending the diagnostic odyssey, the value of knowing, even if there's no actionable information. Hard to measure those things, but we can do it, and we're starting to do surveys and trying to measure that. Economists will talk about externalities, spillover effects, family planning, caregiver health, productivity, scientific spillovers, and things like that. Again, a lot of challenges, but we can make progress, and we need to keep improving.
Well, thank you for that Peter, and you've got your work cut out for you as the health economics community, and as the more we as a community in general get into the conversation about how to advance personalized medicine, we're finding it more and more of a health economics question. And you just brought up a number of additional challenges we got to really take into account. A lot of the clinical challenges, a lot of how you quantify and bring forward some value elements that aren't simply a matter of a data analysis. You know, what's the estimate for full value? And I think Lincoln Nadold is who I'm going to invite to speak next, is perfect to go next, because he really is seeing patients and administering a key program in personalized medicine and deals with these challenges and barriers all the time, and at the same time considers some of these health and economic challenges. So Lincoln.
Well, I have to say this is my favorite conference of the year by far.
It's a requirement now. Everybody must.
But I'm sincere. I feel that way. When I first started coming 5 or 6 years ago, we were really focused in oncology, and I just have to say it's fun to come year after year and see so many friends here, and that's happened again this year. We were focused in oncology because that's clinically where we were motivated. We were sick and tired of seeing patients and not having better answers and better solutions for them, especially when we knew that the science and the technology were available to have better answers. So we implemented a precision oncology program, and as part of that, we measured the outcomes associated with patients who received precision oncology as their care, and we compared that to patients who didn't have any precision oncology. And we published these results and found that patients lived longer, and that on a per week of survival basis, it costs less to do that. That model, that paradigm of identifying a clinical need, implementing a study, and then measuring the outcomes, and then publishing those outcomes, became a paradigm that we then templated into other settings. And since then, we have now expanded, and there's a whole Intermountain Healthcare team here. And if you look at your lanyard, you're all part of the Intermountain team while you're wearing the lanyard, apparently. So welcome. We have now transferred that template into other areas, and we have pharmacogenetic testing. Our organization recently announced that in 2020, pharmacogenetic testing will be a covered benefit for all 80,000 employees and their covered dependents, which I think is pretty remarkable. And I'm proud to work at an organization that has taken that leadership position. We have also now expanded into neonatal testing, and we offer rapid whole genomes for these most vulnerable of our patient populations, these babies that languish in the NICUs for weeks or months at a time on a diagnostic odyssey or without any diagnosis. And we're finding what others have found, that in more than half of cases, we can make a diagnosis of a rare, undiagnosed underlying genetic disorder if we'll do a rapid whole genome. And so we're offering that across our NICUs, and we'll have it in all of our NICUs before the year's end in 2020. So we have seen the good outcomes and have joked amongst ourselves, and even at this conference a couple of years ago, I remember joking, we just need to sequence everyone. And so I'm really thrilled that earlier this summer we announced that in fact that's what we're going to do. So initially I was joking, but you know, be careful what you joke about. It comes true. We are going to do whole genome sequencing in 500,000 people over the next 5 years, healthy and otherwise. So we're dead serious when we say that our mission statement is to help people live the healthiest lives possible. And the mechanism by which we're going to help people live the healthiest lives possible is precision medicine and precision health, and we're going to use genomics to inform us. We believe that the very near future will include genomic information as part of every patient clinic encounter. And so we want to be ready for that and take a leadership position there because it fulfills our mission statement of helping people live the healthiest lives possible. So the way to do that is to, in a disciplined fashion, measure the outcomes every time that you implement something like this, both clinical outcomes and economic impact outcomes. If you don't do that in an era of static healthcare resources, then you're doing the patients a disservice. Our healthcare resources will not continue to grow. They're going to shrink. And so we have to be disciplined when we implement these novel technologies. And that's the approach we're taking. And we publish those results, and then we work with our payer friends to help figure out how the policy should be changed or affected. So That's the approach we're taking, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, Lincoln, for that background as well. And we've spent a lot, and Lincoln just talked a lot about, and the earlier sessions in the meeting have talked a bit about how we can make this case to payers and the key role that the health insurance industry plays in access to these technologies, genomic sequencing included. So I also want to point out, let's not take this as an opportunity to take shots at the payers, because that becomes something that we have to consider ourselves. We have to work in partnership with them. So let me turn it over to Roy Gandolfi to sort of give us that payer perspective and really know that we're coming to you to really learn what we can do to work with.
You want me to come home, right? So first of all, I am very privileged to be sitting on this panel. When Lincoln first asked me, I'm going, I'm not an expert in this field. Why, Lincoln, why do you want me here? What I like to present is a regional approach from a payer instead of a national approach. And I think it has to be explained the role that Intermountain, our parent company, works with the arm, the sister, with Select Health being the payer. And I think what Lincoln just said was the mission statement of living the healthiest life possible. And this has to do with Intermountain's philosophy of partnering with Select Health with shared responsibility and risk, right? So Intermountain, as the self-insured part that Lincoln just mentioned, the 80,000 lives, is stepping out, and instead of looking at from the perspective of large employer groups, the self-insured arm that Intermountain represents is willing to take some of the risk of genetic testing, whether it's pharmacogenomics or whether it has to do with tumor mutation analysis. But it also has to do with the philosophy within Intermountain. I help maintain and write the medical policies for Select Health. We don't do that in a vacuum. We do that with our clinical leaders, where we have clinical programs, whether it's in cardiology, oncology, and then we also have our clinical service lines, whether it's radiology or genomics, working with us because we recognize we're not experts. We need outside help to provide the quality, the safety, the outcomes for our members in order to write the best medical policies, but also to go, are these the correct medical policies at the time? So a few things that, I think everyone in the room has said, well, I'm going to get a denial before I get an approval from a payer, right? We are looked upon as kind of like the negative component of healthcare. Lincoln and I share something. We're still practicing docs. We know what it's like to get that denial, whether for me, it's like, well, why aren't you paying for this brand name when I've tried 5 generics, right? We try, and a little different from other payers, we want our providers to call us. Here's our emails, here's our business numbers, let's interact, let's have communication, which we all recognize is one of the problems occurring within medicine. So I think what we have to look at is the shared risk by a large system helping out the payer. Partly it has to also do with the consumer's influence within the health plan. But what a lot of providers, pharma doesn't recognize is our fiduciary responsibility that we have to the people who buy our insurance. So we've talked about self-insured, right? When I proposed recently, for instance, a bariatric policy and said this is going to reduce costs, I would say 50% of our self-insured plans that we administered said we don't want that benefit. We feel it's going to be too costly. So I think you have to recognize, in the sense of research and the money that we have, our first responsibility is quality care, safety, valued outcomes, but as we all know, we need to keep our premiums to a point that people can afford health care.
That's great.
Well, I agree with that. We all need to understand that, and I really appreciate that you brought up the partnerships that you're engaged in and some of the shared risk that you're being, because that's the perfect segue to Amar, our next panelist. But let's talk about the market. Let's talk about how genomic sequencing is penetrating the market, and talk about where this evidence that is needed to improve this market uptake can come from, especially in the area of partnerships that we're working on to do that. So let me turn it to Mark to talk about some of those things and everything else.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl, and thank you for the PMC for the invite here. It's a great panel. So I lead market access at Illumina, and Illumina is well known as being a platform provider. Illumina 2-3 years ago decided to step out of that platform company to partner, to work with customers in order to improve coverage and reimbursement through different mechanisms. And I'll talk about some of those in a minute. But let's look at real-life examples of what we are dealing with here. Mike Pellini in the previous session mentioned something about the number one reason as a barrier. If you ask anybody what's the barrier for not using NGS, they would tell you coverage and reimbursement. And this is why I stopped doing surveys, because I know this is coming as number one reason in a way. But it's deeper than this. And I would like to mention 2 examples. One is, just take a look, if you are a practicing community oncologist, at the medical policies of your cancer patients covered under different insurance companies. The first patient comes in 70 years old, covered under the National Coverage Determination for comprehensive genomic profiling for all solid tumors. That's great. The second patient comes in, covered for comprehensive genomic profiling for non-small cell lung cancer only, which is the majority of the coverage for comprehensive genomic profiling. The third patient, a third insurance company, comes in where the insurance does not even pay for large panels, and they request those panels to be less than 50 genes in non-small cell lung cancer only. How would you be able to comprehend all of this when you go to your practice? And this should be the last thing you should be thinking of. Add to this the administrative hurdles when it comes to the prior authorizations and all of those things. This is the real life that community oncologists deal with every day when it comes to those challenges. And that impacts definitely the utilization of genomics. But let me tell you about the second example, which will be probably shocking to most. And that came through our partnership with Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, Cancer Genetics, and now also we have PMC with us working closely. We looked at coverage and utilization across the nation in the US. So what we did is we looked at genomic utilization and we looked at medical policies. And what we found really is that even when you have 2 geographies with similar medical policies or similar coverage, the utilization was different. And the comprehensive genomic profiling is a good example of that. Non-invasive prenatal testing is a good example of that. But take whole exome sequencing in rare undiagnosed genetic diseases. Today, 150 million people in the US covered for whole exome sequencing for rare undiagnosed genetic diseases. We did the math quickly. We expected that with such number of lives, at least 300 to 500,000 tests should take place every year under the most conservative scenario, knowing that not all of those will be diagnosed by whole exome. They could be diagnosed just by looking at the kids. Do you know how many tests have been performed in the US over 1 year? 2,500 tests of whole exome sequencing. And so when you look at the policies of the 150 million lives, they're fairly consistent. There is not much that challenge about those. So you see all of those levels some of those related to the confusion, physicians being overwhelmed, but some of these are really deeper than this. Even when coverage exists, there is less utilization. And so there are solutions. We could propose solutions, and I would like to talk about solutions, and maybe we can jump into that if you want.
Well, thank you very much for that. And it really points to some of these clinical adoption challenges that Kenna Mills-Shaw had brought up in the previous panel as well, that this isn't just a access issue. It is an access issue, but it's a complicated view of access. It's not just, does the payer pay for it? What are all of these factors that are coming in? And do we need to tell the doctor time and time again that this information is available and you can use this when we're trying to change the paradigm of care? So let's talk about that, guys. I'm not going to call out any particular person, but what are the barriers, the key barriers driving underutilization of genomic sequencing technology?
You know, I can say this. Physicians are the worst.
You can say.
Not everyone gets to say that. You know, trying to change a physician's behavior is like the hardest thing on the planet. And so you can have a partnership with your payer. You know, Roy and I are good friends. I mean, we talk all the time. And you heard what a remarkable thing he said, that they work with their experts, their clinical colleagues who are experts in a certain area to write their medical coverage policies. That's phenomenal. And that's an example of why we hear over and over again that we should work with our payer partners as much as possible and communicate and sit down at the table and collaboratively come up with something that makes sense, coverage policies that make sense. Now, even when that happens, trying to get a physician to change his or her behavior is really difficult because they're dealing with the workaday requirements of entering things into the EMR and, you know, checking off boxes and seeing patients. And they were trained to care for patients in a certain way 10, 15, 20 years ago, and trying to change that is really hard. And you have to talk to them yesterday and today and tomorrow, and you have to have decision support and all those things. So you can have all of the policies you want, you can provide coverage, you can have fancy reports that help you interpret what the results mean and all those things. But at the end of the day, it's the physician that has to be well enough educated and informed and up to date to know how to order these and why you should order them and when and all that.
Yeah, I'm glad you said physicians are the worst, because I usually hear economists are the worst. So.
Economists actually are the worst.
Are the worst.
But I didn't dare say that with you sitting here, so physicians are the worst.
Okay. It's certainly hard to change behavior, and we often think about three ways we do that. One is information and research, and I think there's certainly a place for that, and we're talking about that, and that can be improved. Education is the second. We talk a lot about that. The third is incentives, which we've been hearing about a bit, and of course, you need changes in incentives. So research alone and education alone probably doesn't do it. I think the evidence shows it doesn't change behavior, absent, or usually doesn't, or doesn't do it very much, absent real change in incentives. So we need to reform payment systems. We've been hearing about this throughout the day. Someone once said we have 21st century technology, 20th century payment systems. Maybe it's even 19th century payment systems in some ways. So there's experiments with innovative contracting. We mentioned this morning. We can talk about that. There's places like CMMI that potentially could do pilot studies. There are many, many challenges, but I think we certainly have to focus on systemic change as well.
So we talk about evidence as one of the solutions, right? So we were talking about relating this to Game of Thrones just today. The dragon glass that's going to fight the winter is evidence. But what kind of evidence do we need? I mean, how do we get it?
Well, I certainly will defer to my colleagues on that question too. But I mentioned earlier, clinical trials can improve. Real-world data is exciting, and lots of things to do in that realm. I mentioned decision analytic models to help us fill in the gaps, to try to better understand long-term consequences. So all of those tools I think need to be improved.
I mean, incentives. I'm so glad you mentioned incentives. That one of the dirty secrets in oncology, at least, is that in some cases physicians act as the pharmacy and they get paid based on what they infuse, and so the incentive to implement some kind of genomic test that is going to indicate an oral therapy is a misaligned incentive. And we see that in real time. I know that Roy sees that as well. And then the flip side of that coin is that, you know, these hospital-based practices, they love to bill as if they infused in a hospital. And so they'll mark up the cost of the drug 2 or 3 times. And, you know, Roy, I think, would probably much rather deal with an independent freestanding infusion clinic than with a hospital-based infusion clinic that's going to mark up. So the incentives are misaligned. I'm glad you mentioned that.
I just want to make sure that you recognize that Intermountain is just one big happy family all the time. There's disagreement between our responsibility as a payer and what Lincoln wants to provide. And I'll give you the example of the pharmacogenomics. As we all know, pharmacogenomics for decades has been, let's just say, the holy grail of appropriate pharmaceutical care. And unfortunately, the data that we see has been promising, but when we look at efficacy or side effects and ER visits and hospitalizations and cost effectiveness, sometimes the payer will look at this and go, we don't think that there's still the value that we see. Now, what we're actually hoping for is that Lincoln's data on pharmacogenomics, here you have Intermountain, self-insured plan, part of Select Health, which is now going to cover pharmacogenomics in specific criteria for those individuals who have depression, failed multiple drugs, ordered by a psychiatrist, so there's a little limited frame, is going to then give us the clinical outcomes showing that in a shared risk situation, that the value of doing the test was worthwhile for providing better care and less costs because of those issues I just addressed.
And we'll monitor that real world evidence, and it's all of the Intermountain team members that are here, and we'll take that back to Roy and say, here's what we saw when we implemented this.
Yeah. And so,
and there, from there, we can go and say to our employers who buy our insurance, we now have demonstrated that this additional cost, which may then increase your premium, is going to be worthwhile in the long run.
yeah. So we heard, you know, the words of sharing the risk, aligning incentives. And I would like just to mention quickly, what are we doing around those 2 areas within Illumina? There are certain applications whereby, you know, the application, there is a proof concept, there is some data that this works, but maybe a certain patient population that you are expanding into where you do not have data. The typical example to that is non-invasive prenatal testing in what's called low-risk pregnancies or average-risk pregnancies, where 2 of the major insurers in the US, they're saying, no, we're not going to be covering that population because there is no clinical utility data. We know there is clinical utility in high risk. What's really missing is what's the impact of applying that to a larger population, especially from an economic perspective. And this is how we started a discussion with Michael Sherman at Harvard Pilgrim. And we said, you know what, as Illumina, we're willing to work with you to build the evidence in a completely transparent manner. So you open access to those patients or to those women. And what we will do as Illumina is look at clinical and economic utility after 1 year together. We'll publish the data. And if there is a higher cost associated with that introduction, we'll get you risk-free. We'll take that cost as Illumina completely. And the test is not an Illumina test. Anybody who does NIPT would be able to be part of that program. We presented the data a month ago about the clinical utility, and we have seen 15% reduction in invasive testing. And we presented last week the economic utility. There was some money that we needed to pay back to Harvard Pilgrim, but when you calculate that money on a per member per month, it's a very negligible budget impact. This is why Harvard Pilgrim decided to keep that coverage. And now I'm glad to say that we are expanding that to whole genome sequencing in rare and diagnosed genetic diseases. So first of all, we need more Harvard Pilgrims, probably.
They're called Intermountain.
Yeah.
So before I invite everybody to talk about some of these population expectations and managing them with a personalized medicine strategy, it's difficult. Let me invite everybody in the audience to come up and we'll take a question. But first, we'll take as many questions as we can fit in with the remaining time. But first, how do we do this? How do we manage these population level expectations? What's the best way? What's the best strategies from a provider perspective, an economic perspective, as developer perspective? We're talking about a personalized medicine strategy where the benefits are going to be extreme, very, very significant for some people. But how do those translate into the population? So.
I think we just heard clinical utility, good experiment, and then we take that information and say, there's a value, there's a responsibility, this is what we need to do. I mean, I heard someone, I think it was very interesting, about laboratory benefit manager, and I've been waiting for ACOG to come out with a recommendation to do it for not high risk, but also low risk individuals with pregnancy for cell-free DNA. We don't have all the expertise. I mean, I rely on Lincoln mostly from the oncological world, but we also have a vendor who helps us with the laboratory benefit. And in this area, they were, I would say, more generous, more lenient, and covered it for the low risk even before we implemented it. So there's some good and bad about the laboratory benefit manager, and recognize that any payer who just assumes the policy of that laboratory benefit manager is doing themselves a disservice. You need to reach out to the providers that you are asking and working with, their opinion, just like we have done with Lincoln in this regard. And actually, I would say that we were one of the first to offer tumor mutation analysis for solid organs because we felt that the only way a patient could be enrolled in a clinical trial was to get the test done. And we all recognize, too, that in this pharma world that we live in, the cost of the test is minuscule compared with the cost of the drug, right? So we looked at this and said, it's a win for us to get those patients in need to be enrolled in clinical trials. We should make this test available, and this partnership is what made it work.
Pharma should just be giving away these tests, in my opinion.
What do you think? What do you think?
My name's David Holland. I'm from Roche in the UK.
So you should give away the foundation test for free.
Firstly, what I would like to say is, having spent the last 10 years working in a HTA market, health economists are definitely the worst. I think the theme has come out a couple of times we've come through this, and it's about value. If you want to drive up clinical adoption of testing, what changes a clinician's mind is an understanding of what is the ultimate value, but not just to them, their healthcare system, but also that ultimate patient piece. Yep. So the clinical trials, the evidence generation, but also the real world data to feed that, to grow a totality of evidence to support this, that can feed much more accurate modeling so that you reduce the level of uncertainty that's coming out of that is, I think, what we're certainly seeing from a UK perspective. That's what's changed these hearts and minds, which is where we're at right now.
Well, so what we have seen is along those exact lines, in a real-world, pragmatic way, what changes physician behavior is a good experience. Mm-hmm. And it really just takes one. And they're susceptible to recency bias. So if they...
Aren't we all?
I'm allowed to say that also. So if you sequence a patient and you find some therapy and the patient does well, suddenly that changes your entire perspective, and you want that for your subsequent patients. So it's really getting them over that first
My
barrier.
question to the group is, how do you drive up a consistent approach to doing that across a fragmented healthcare system?
Yeah, well, I agree with you, not that health economists are the worst, but that its value is important. There's a lot of evidence that in the U.S., price of therapies and prices of medicine in general is not aligned with value, and utilization of those therapies that are not aligned with value are being used. So, one answer we haven't talked a lot about is HTA in the U.S. We have our friends at ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, down the road here. doing cost-effectiveness analyses now routinely of new drugs, some of which have tests that go along with that. So, another piece of the puzzle, I think, is in the U.S. HTA. It raises a lot of questions. We could have our own panel on all of those questions, but I think that would help us drive towards value as well.
May I also comment on that? I mean, definitely we need a learning healthcare system, and the learning cannot be a vicious circle of learning for every single system. Let's look at other systems, what work well. Take a look, for example, today at NHS in England. They decided to commission whole genome sequencing in rare undiagnosed genetic diseases. And this is the most conservative system in the world. I have an interest to know, why did they do that? Like, why would the most conservative system in the world move in that direction? And when you look at what they did, they had to say, you know what, our health technology assessment, which is nice in England, will never be able to deal with this. So what we will do, we will bypass them completely and change the system. Those transformational changes cannot happen in a fragmented system.
We probably only have time for about 2 more questions. So, Stephen, I'll turn it to you, and we'll hopefully get to all the questions.
Thank you. I have one very quick question and one maybe a little bit longer. I accept that Intermountain is one big happy family, but why is Roy sitting all by himself?
I noticed that as well.
He denied one of my drugs yesterday, so we're in a little bit of a spat right now.
Got it, Lincoln. The question I have maybe relates, Daryl, to the population issue, and that is the response of the global health community to precision medicine isn't exactly neutral. I mean, there's been a rise, and the Rockefeller Foundation is funding precision public health. And I think all of this portends a concern about global health inequity as maybe related to precision medicine. So my question is directed at Amar, and that is, I was really excited to learn of your shift in business model towards partnering. That makes amazing sense. Do you anticipate partnering with some of the more able developing countries in laying some of the groundwork for precision medicine? Because there's a lot of interest, but capacity isn't quite there.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, we're working with some of them. I know definitely Rwanda came, for example, to the discussion a while ago, and some countries in Africa. And that's something that Illumina is really very passionate about. If you look at the company culture, in fact, at Illumina, I mean, it is a very transparent, patient-focused type of environment, regardless of what country, what system. We're ready to work with them as much as we're saying we need to bring the cost of sequencing down to $100. So we will help any system get through the clinical implementation stage and then see how they need to manage that moving forward.
And we will have a session featuring some international global programs and a little bit about the developing world in tomorrow's program. So you've got the last question. You're going to drive it home. This is going to lead us into lunch, so it's got to be a good question.
All right. Well, my name is Gary Stone, and I'm the executive director at Intermountain Precision Genomics. I'm not a plant.
It's the happy family.
I have a real question. I really do. Just because, and I'm the operations partner to Lincoln, and I've really lived the development and implementation of precision genomics at Intermountain Healthcare. And I think one of my own observations, particularly around pharmacogenomics, that I just kind of want to noodle on a little bit, and relates to the employer. So we have worked together at Intermountain Healthcare to work on clinical trials for the advancement of precision medicine, but also worked with payers. We work with government payers and private payers, and we talk a lot about that here at PMC, and as well as providers and getting feedback from providers. But I think what was an interesting observation for me, and forgive me if this is naive, is the reality that engaging our chief people officer in human resources, who is in charge of the benefits of our organization, to really engage in this process helped, I think, accelerate precision genomics becoming covered. And when I kind of, because we've tried to kind of figure this out together, and yes, there have been bumps and bruises along the way. So when I looked at that and observed that, I just wondered, Ed, maybe particularly as we think about PMC membership and those who we're inviting, we invite pharma here, we invite industry, but I just wonder about big employers. And I'm going to throw out my favorite big employer besides Intermountain Healthcare, and that's Disney. I'm a Disney fan. So I just think about Disney, with all of these employees, Disney's a big customer of healthcare. Yeah. And how are we engaging, and do we need to, with their chief people officers regarding precision medicine? Because when I think about economics, what really drives economics in one sense is the demand of the consumer. And the consumers are living as employees inside the employer, and the employer's the purchaser. So I just wondered your thoughts on that.
Well, I think having them at the table makes sense. They're the ones paying for the insurance. They would be sharing the risk then in order to develop and maybe get research underway. Another thought that I had was, I don't know if you know about Intermountain's Civica, our consortium of hospitals that are now coming, I think it was just last week, came out with the first generic drug that was in shortage. It was vancomycin. And this was, I mean, I think it's almost 100 facilities across the US that are engaged with decreasing costs that the hospitals saw instead of paying significant prices for generics, right? So maybe using this Civica as a tool of bringing everyone together to discuss about sharing of data, about sharing of risk, about taking some of that responsibility that we have financially, putting it into a nonprofit to help fund research besides NIH and these entities, that we bring all the hospital systems together, that would be a win.
So let me just invite everybody to thank Roy, Amar, Lincoln, and Peter for a great session. I'll turn it back over to Ed.
I'm here to inform you that lunch will be served on the second and third floors, and it's a seated lunch, and I hope we continue networking before coming back at 2:10 for a discussion of personalized medicine and the opioid crisis.